In today's video, we're taking a look at some more NHL trade rumors featuring the Toronto Maple Leafs, Montreal Canadiens, New York Rangers, and the Winnipeg Jets. We'll jump into all the latest coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we're getting closer and closer here to the NHL Trade Deadline. There's new rumors and new information popping up through NHL insiders pretty much on a daily basis. So today we're looking at four main teams, and let's kick things off here with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, the Leafs are a team that's been heavily discussed here over the last number of weeks. Lots of talk about what upgrades they may try to make ahead of the deadline to put themselves in a position to get past the first round of the playoffs, make a deeper run, and see what they can do here. They've got all kinds of offensive talent, but clearly they do have some spots on their team, including the blue line and backup goaltending that has been long rumored here to be addressed, and yet we're waiting for some moves to be made. Of course, yesterday we talked about a trade between the Leafs and the Habs that was being discussed by TVA Sports. Of course, that trade was not linked to any kind of inside information. It was just a concept by the writer outlining how he thought the Leafs and Habs could help each other with a solid trade on both sides. If you haven't caught that video, I'll link it up here in the YouTube cards. It kind of outlines the full thoughts of the article and what they're proposing there, and you can watch that and let me know what you think, if that's something those teams should explore. But this information comes from NHL insider Elliotte Friedman, where he's talking about the fact that the Maple Leafs have shown interest in Matt Dumba. Now, Dumba is a player we've talked about before. He's a younger, right-shot defenseman with term on his contract, which is right up what the Leafs alley here, what Kyle Dubas is looking for. It's pretty much known that he's not really looking for a rental player. He wants somebody who he can bring into the fold on that right side of the blue line with term, who's young enough and can be with this team on a longer term basis. Now, it's also been reported that Dumba's certainly not the only defenseman that the Leafs are looking at. There's league executives around the NHL reporting to Friedman that you can pretty much say that the Leafs are exploring any and all good and decent D options that could be available. There's lots of conversations going on amongst the Leafs management with a lot of other NHL clubs, and they're going to try to nail down what they feel are their best choices and best options ahead of the deadline. So as I mentioned before, Dumba is a very intriguing player. Certainly somebody who can put up 50, 60 points, but it's having a bit of a down season. The Wild are also having a down season. If you look at their contracts and what options GM Bill Guerin might have, he might have to trade somebody of value to get value. So guys like Dumba and Jason Zucker are getting a lot of attention and are popping up a lot in the rumor mill, and it could certainly bring back some decent returns for the Wild to try to move forward. So obviously Dumba is a pretty solid D. You wouldn't think they'd want to move him, and it might not be a case of wanting to. It's just what you feel is best to move your team forward, and also at the same time, that team's also handcuffed by some bad contracts, and you can only move certain players who have value with good contracts. So I guess we'll see what happens here with the Leafs, but Friedman's reporting they are exploring any and all options on the D market, but he specifically mentioned Dumba that they've inquired on, and I guess we'll see if it goes anywhere or not. Now, there's another article from the New York Post talking about the Rangers, which again links back to the Maple Leafs and a potential Rangers-Leaf swap, which is something we've heard a lot about over the last probably month or more. This article goes on to talk about some New York Rangers players who could find themselves traded ahead of the deadline. A couple of the key players that I want to touch on here from this article is defenseman Tony DeAngelo and backup goaltender Alexander Georgiev. Now, Georgiev's been linked to the Leafs for some time. He's been linked to the Leafs is because of his contract. The Leafs don't have a lot of salary cap space. They need a backup goalie they can rely on for a very little price, and he certainly would provide that at least for the current year. So there's that option that kind of links the two teams. Obviously, the Rangers are in the market to move a goalie, and he seems to be the most logical one that they would trade. So obviously, there's that link. Now, bring in Tony DeAngelo. Now, DeAngelo is a defenseman right now, not making a lot of money, but he is going to be looking for a significant raise. He's having another solid NHL season. Now, I mentioned him before as a player that I thought it made sense for the Rangers to consider trading if they can get the right price. Not that they don't like DeAngelo. He certainly has brought a lot to the offensive side of the blue line for them, but like a lot of blue liners that play strong offense, they just have some defensive deficiencies. I think that's fair to say, but with other longer-term contracts on the books already for like Jacob Trouba, Brady Shea, etc., they have other young guys like Adam Fox in the fold there with New York. Moving a guy like DeAngelo might be possible to get some good value to help other areas of the club. So certainly the possibility of packaging up Georgiev and DeAngelo from New York over to Toronto from a lot of perspectives, does make some sense. Now, it doesn't mean for sure that the Leafs are going to go for that, but based on everything today, I do think the deal makes sense. Clearly, the Leafs have some trade chips that they're exploring. Likely would have to move one of their young forwards. It could possibly end up being Kasperi Kapanen, Andreas Janssen, or one of those types of players. Maybe package with another pick or prospect or something else. Hard to say exactly what the package would include, but those are certainly players that it would make sense from a cap perspective that the Leafs could afford to bring in on a short-term basis and also afford to re-sign on a longer-term basis, especially if they can move Cody Ceci. They could afford to basically give Ceci's salary to D'Angelo, which is probably going to be somewhere in the neighborhood that he's going to be looking for on probably some type of a bridge contract would be my guess. So clearly that does make sense for the Leafs, but at the same time, as much as he would shore up the right side, help provide even more offense, there is something to be said here about having a more defensive defenseman come in, because it's certainly more of the defensive side of the game that they need help with. So it may not be the perfect choice, but it is an option out there. The Rangers are looking to explore, and it makes sense for Toronto to explore. So could these two teams end up making a move after all the talk about Georgiev to the Leafs? I do think it is a possibility, but based on what Friedman's saying about Kyle Dubas, he's exploring so many options, it's really difficult to say what direction they head in here currently. Now, after yesterday's conversation regarding the Leafs and Habs and that proposed trade I was talking about from TVA Sports, Friedman did go on to update what he feels the Habs plans are going to be ahead of the deadline. And as of right now, he's saying if the Habs do fall out of the playoffs, which obviously they're having a tough time getting back in that conversation right now, as we get to the deadline, if it's looking like they haven't climbed back in, that he feels that things might be relatively quiet in Montreal. He doesn't expect Marc Bergevin to make too many significant moves, and probably very little activity on the forefront there. Maybe a couple pending UFAs moved off as rental players, but nothing too crazy. Obviously, like there's been talk about guys like Thomas Tatar and Jeff Petrie with a little bit of term left, generating some interest. There's been other talk as well about other moves they might make. Like I said yesterday, we talked about Max Domi, based on that report from TVA indicating that they felt he should be somebody that Montreal should look to trade. But Friedman says that based on the information he has, which is certainly more reliable than TVA, that the Habs likely are going to proceed here cautiously and likely have a relatively quiet NHL trade deadline while they focus on bouncing back for next year. Clearly, injuries have taken a toll on the Habs this season, certainly played a role in their lack of wins and certainly points in the standings. At the same time, there are certainly moves that need to be made. There are areas of that roster that does need to be improved. They have certainly some players not playing up to their full capabilities this year, and all of that combined just really adds up to a bit of a write-off, and they feel like they can reset and start fresh next year without doing anything too significant, at least at the deadline. I would imagine Marc Bergevin would reevaluate and make some other moves during the offseason, but for right now, we might not see anything too crazy out of Montreal, according to Friedman. Now, of course, the Battle of Alberta was reignited last night, and we saw newly signed forward Zach Kassian have a scrap with Matthew Tkachuk of the Calgary Flames and kind of get things settled after the previous game, which there were certainly all kinds of words being thrown around and all kinds of what seemed to be kind of threats of what might happen in the next game. Of course, NHL player safety head George Peros was in attendance as well. We saw a few good scraps, and overall a very highly entertaining hockey game. It's safe to say the Battle of Alberta is back, and personally, I would be all for seeing these two teams battle in a long, hard-fought playoff series. It would be nice to see something like that go 6-7 games. I think it'd be highly entertaining to say the least. We saw some scraps between Kassian and Tkachuk. We also saw even Sean Monahan do battle with Ryan Nugent-Hopkins as well. So certainly a very entertaining game. But of course, Zach Kassian coming off a newly inked contract extension with the Edmonton Oilers. He signed a 4-year deal with an average annual value of $3.2 million. The first 2 years of that contract does include a $1 million signing bonus, where the final 2 years is just straight salary. There is no trade protection built into this contract either. Of course, Kassian's having one of his better seasons right now, playing a lot on the top line with McDavid and Draisaitl, certainly providing a bit of a physical force out there, and certainly found himself a bit of a niche player with the Oilers. Clearly, he, leading into this year, he had struggled to find consistency. Was played on the fourth line quite a bit. And this year so far, he's put up 28 points in 43 games, which is certainly a nice increase for sure. I do have concerns over the contract. The way he's playing right now, if he can keep that up for the full 4 years, it'll certainly be a valuable contract, and he'll prove to be a valuable asset to the Oilers. But based on his past history, of course, I do have concern that he can maintain that and be that player that long term. So I guess only time will tell. For right now, I think the contract's fine, but it could be something that the Oilers live to regret in a year or two time, possibly down the road. I guess only time will tell. We'll have to see here. But either way, he's been signed to a 4-year extension by the Oilers. Now, also some news out of Boston concerning David Backes. As we discussed before the All-Star break, it was revealed that he was put on waivers, and he did clear, but it wasn't really clear if he was going to the minors or what was going to happen with him. And the Bruins did make an announcement today from General Manager Don Sweeney indicating that David Backes would not be reporting to their AHL team in Providence. That basically it sounds like he's kind of going to be staying home. He's kind of in limbo. He may or may not be practicing with the team. They didn't really clarify that I could see in the press release, but he's not going to the minors is really all we know. I would imagine the Bruins would love to trade him, but it's certainly going to be proving difficult to do. Maybe they're okay with him staying in limbo right now. Maybe they're engaged in some trade talks. Hard to say exactly where things go, but clearly he's not really a fit in their current lineup. He's sitting out, and I guess we'll see. If he's not playing anywhere, that can't really be good overall from trying to boost his value type of approach, but at the same time, I can understand why the veteran might not want to go down and play in the American Hockey League. But I guess we'll have to see what happens with David Backes here in the short term. I mean, it was revealed before that the Anaheim Ducks might be a team willing to take on some not so favorable contracts if it meant getting some other good assets along with it. Maybe that would be a team for Sweeney to be talking to see about taking the Backes contract as well as having to give up some kind of other assets to make it something that the Ducks will be willing to do. I guess we'll have to see what happens. But for right now, Backes is not going down to the AHL. Now, as we mentioned here as well, we also want to touch on the Winnipeg Jets. Of course, as we mentioned in the last couple of days, the Jets are kind of held in limbo right now as well. Kind of handcuffed by the whole Dustin Byfuglien situation. But there are some other defensemen that they could be looking at, according to NHL insiders, that certainly would appease their salary cap situation and might help upgrade a few things here. And that includes one of the defensemen we've already talked about, in Tony DeAngelo of the New York Rangers. Of course, we saw the Jets and Rangers hook up on prior trades, including the Jacob Trouba deal. As well, we saw the Kevin Hayes trade last year at the trade deadline. So these two teams are quite familiar with each other. DeAngelo is a player who could be a great help to the Winnipeg Jets. In my opinion, he's young enough and controllable asset that they could get him signed and wouldn't break the bank, at least on a short-term basis. So might be a good move. Of course, the Carolina Hurricanes could be looking at DeAngelo as well. Clearly, they have a need with Dougie Hamilton being out for the rest of the season with that broken fibula. So that's clearly two teams to keep your eye on. As I already mentioned, he could be a player that the Leafs are looking at, but those two teams make a lot of sense to be looking at DeAngelo here as well. Now, of course, that's not the only defenseman from the Jets' perspective that it makes sense for them to check out. Other defensemen that were named here by NHL insiders the Jets could be looking at include Ottawa Senators Dylan DeMello, who's kind of in limbo right now if he's going to be traded or not. He's had a pretty decent year in Ottawa, and there is some possibilities that he could be dealt ahead of the deadline where he doesn't have a contract. Of course, there's always Alec Martinez in LA as well, who has 1 year left on his term. So there's a few more guys that could fit the Jets' plans. Like I said, they don't necessarily have to break the bank, but at the same time, while they're figuring out the Byfuglien situation, the Jets might be able to bring in and get some help on that blue line. It's also mentioned here by these reports that Jack Roslovic might be the forward that they decide to dangle to help bring a defenseman in that they so desperately need after all the guys that left last offseason. So that is all your latest updates for today. Of course, as always, I want to know your thoughts and opinions and everything discussed, so make sure you leave lots of comments down below and we can discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing, turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it as well. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.